All right, welcome everyone. This is Dhaiphong. I am in Brussels city center with the legendary Chen Weihua. He's the EU bureau chief at China Daily. We just
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so
Yes.
glad to see you here, Danny. I mean,
It's great.
in Brussels, face to face.
Yeah. It's great. We're out here. We just had a good meal, just had some beer, some dinner, and now we're here to talk for a few minutes. Well, let's begin with you, Chen. Tell us first, most people will know you in the United States from your tweets. You became pretty infamous, especially a few years back, going after Marsha Blackburn, Mike Pompeo, their anti-China messages and propaganda they were sending over social media. What prompted you to respond, and tell us more about yourself.
Well, I have to say, I mean, upfront, I actually love American people. I spent a total of like 11 years in the United States, from Hawaii to New York City to Washington, D.C. to Minnesota. I have a lot of good American friends. People actually I would even take bullet for. But, unfortunately, I disagree so much with some of the politicians. You just mentioned the Marsha Blackburn. I mean, nasty Washington politician who I would call McCarthyist, China haters, because they don't make arguments based on facts, just smearing all these sort of taking China the boogeyman. So that's what I'm having issue with. I don't have issue with the whole United States. I love a lot of things there.
Well, yeah, you've actually done work in the United States, correct? And you've been all around the world with you doing journalism, and it's kind of a dangerous time in the United States in particular, around China. Give us, maybe if you can give us an idea of your work, and then how you see this current moment between the United States and China.
Yes, I actually was, work-wise, I was in the United States from 2009, 2018. Literally Obama's 8 years in office and the first year and a half of the Trump administration. So looking back, I mean, it's really, I mean, we had issue. I'm a columnist too. So I wrote column critical of Obama's China policy. We have some issues. But looking back, I mean, it's really like a honeymoon in those days. I mean, we get so much things done. Obama invited President Xi to the nuclear summit. China and the U.S. fought against Ebola in West Africa, joining hands. I mean, there was annual meetings, high level. There was some 90 bilateral senior level talk mechanisms, and China and the United States also actually had this historical 10 years of visa program in the Obama year. I think, if I remember correctly, it's like 2016. So, I mean, Obama introduced this 100,000 strong program encouraging American students to study in China, and it's encouraging American students to study Chinese. So everything, people to people exchange, and Chinese tourists going to visit America in droves thanks to the visa program. So it's all good actually. We are going, we're understanding each other much better in those years than like 40 years ago, Nixon, because I always argue, people say we are different, yes, but we were far more different when Nixon established this, sort of made the high ice-breaking trip to China. Jimmy Carter established diplomatic ties with China. We were so much more different in the 1970s. I mean, then today we're much more closer, I would say. I mean, we have differences. Some differences are not going to change in our lifetime. I would not being optimistic or pessimistic. That was just different culture. I mean, we all have a different understanding of issue, but that doesn't mean we have to kill each other, be enemies. We disagree with our neighbors. We probably disagree with our parents, children, sister, brothers. and friends. I mean, but that still mean we can get along, go to dinner together. I don't even maybe agree 100% with Danny, but we're good friends. I think even I saw him the first time. I met him on Twitter, seminars. But unfortunately, I think the Trump administration, the second year, reversed, this decades of U.S. policy with China, which is mostly engagement. Engagement, I think, works very well. More understanding. What do you expect? More understanding is better for everyone. So if you don't engage, if you don't talk to each other, you're only going to have more hostility, more misunderstanding, more accidents. That's all the rational. It's common sense to me.
Well, since Obama, we had the pivot to Asia, and the military encirclement of China, spearheaded by the United States, really escalated under Trump. Economic war, trade war, sanctions. Now, Biden has not been a reversal of those policies. Even just in the last week, we've had Biden administration officials, Lloyd Austin, pointing the fingers at China at the Shangri-La dialogue, saying that China's the one not talking to the United States, that freedom of navigation is very important to China as well. Meanwhile, there have been warships between Canada and the United States sailing through the Taiwan Strait. What do you make of the current situation under the Biden administration? It seems like things have actually cooled even more, especially since that balloon incident in February, which led to China saying that it needed to cut off some communication, or at least lower the communication, because according to people like Mao Ning, foreign ministry spokesperson, spokespeople Wang Wenbin, they're all saying the same thing. They're saying that the United States needs to respect China before there can really be any fruitful talks. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I would say it's a huge disappointment to me when the Biden administration take office and hasn't kept the promise it made, reverse Trump's trade policy, such as trade war, tariff war, which actually he criticized during the campaign. And just remember, most of the Biden administration people, from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, to Tony Blinken, and to many others, even Janet Yellen, others, all served in the Obama administration. So they know exactly what they have conducted. I remember Blinken's wife, Ryan. I was the State Department Assistant Secretary in charge of culture. Exactly. So the 100 Strong initiative encouraged Chinese language learning in the U.S. Now they demonize all the Confucius Institute, all these languages. It doesn't hurt. 300 million Chinese are studying English. And the Chinese government encourages that. Don't demonize it, the language learning, because the more language you speak, the more smarter. Here I'm in Brussels. I would love to have a private free tutor teaching me French, Dutch.
All the languages they speak here.
I want to learn them all, actually. The more, the better. But that said, I think you mentioned Lloyd Austin. I think because the facts are always distorted. A lot of people have been hyping up this Taiwan Strait situation. But as a Chinese, I'm speaking only for myself. The last thing the Chinese want is another war among the Chinese, because everybody remember what the civil war in 1940s looked like. It's horrible. It's like what the Europeans should remember here. We are in Brussels. Where everywhere you go, it's all the cemetery, the monuments of all the bunkers of World War I, World War II. World War I killed more than 40 million Europeans. That's crazy. They just slept to walk into the World War. And I'm worried about that. I think, we can solve the differences, however different we are, through dialogue, more understanding. And I always say, argue, actually, sometimes our differences are not, sometimes, I've lived in the U.S. for long. So I said some differences between China and the U.S. are not actually as big as sometimes between California, Texas. They have difference over many issues. Even on abortion rights, for example. Actually, I think the Chinese would have a more, say, similarity with the blue states in the United States. I mean, that's just one example. There are many other issues, attitudes towards social issues. I think, we are not really that different. So the more Chinese friends you have, the more you are able to see. I think the Chinese are really upset because if you ask 1.4 billion Chinese, because I always tell people the only thing you need to understand China first, you understand what 1.4 billion means. That's literally a fifth of humanity. Every 5 people in the world, there is one Chinese. So it literally means if there is one consensus among the 1.4 billion, it's about peaceful national reunification. And if anyone wants to push for Taiwan independence, as the DPP in Taiwan try to do, as some hawks in Washington try to push for, and then you're going to have a big issue with the Chinese population. But if you just keep the status quo and let the Chinese solve themselves, because the 1992 consensus, which agreed by the Chinese mainland Taiwan before the current leader Tsai Ing-wen, is there is only one China. Both the mainland and Taiwan belong to one China, even you could maybe define it slightly differently. And let's remember, under Tsai's predecessor, Mr. Ma Ying-jeou, I actually met him in Washington in the Brookings Institution talk. I mean, under his leadership in Taiwan from 2008 and 2016, the mainland Taiwan had a great peace, stability, and prosperity. I mean, I actually, unfortunately, was the only person in my big family who haven't visited Taiwan. Everyone, I mean, the older Chinese tourists going to Taiwan, and Taiwanese. I live in Shanghai. My apartment in a quarter where a lot of Taiwanese. So it's not like we don't understand. I mean, since the 1990s, we know a lot of Taiwanese. They speak Mandarin, and so we're so similar. I mean, but we know it's not just language or food, but we can communicate very well. I mean, we may disagree on some issue, so let's keep it that way. More engagement, more dialogue. I always believe if we cannot solve the issue, some thorny issue, maybe our children, my grandchildren, have more wisdom. So let's do not provoke, which I think the U.S., some hawks in Washington is exactly doing that, try to provoke China. If you even talk to some of the Washington think tank folks which study China-U.S. relations, study Taiwan, actually they're not pro the Chinese mainland government, they're more pro Taiwan, but they all would argue, they tell you like Richard Bush, the Brookings, they will give you lots of examples how the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo, until the current Biden administration made a lot of change in the status quo U.S. policy regarding Taiwan, -1, big one. So, measures, provocations. U.S. government before Obama's administration would never have done that.
Right. Well, speaking of provocations, I know you've been following what's going on in Ukraine quite closely. There's been the dam explosion in Kherson. You are a bureau chief here in Brussels, and you've been covering the European Union for quite some time. Now, there's also, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, there's also African leaders meeting with Putin and Zelensky, I believe, from various countries, Zambia, Republic of Congo. Also, China has played a very constructive role seeking peace talks. The Chinese envoy has been traveling around meeting with related parties, trying to figure out how to engage in dialogue around peace. Give us your impressions of what's going on right now with this conflict, because a lot of people have been making the connections between Ukraine, Taiwan,
Yeah.
Russia, China, and this building confrontation of the United States and the collective West toward these two countries. What's
Yeah.
your impression?
Well, I think yeah, there is really a danger. Some hawks, I mean, especially the China hawks in the West, in Washington, or in Europe, try to drive a wedge. I mean, try to erecting those new political blocks in the world, like the Cold War years. I think that's not good. I think some actually quietly hope China would take Russia's side against Ukraine. Then they could convince now the more reluctant European to take an alienated view of China. I think China and has had a good relation with both Russia and Ukraine for decades, and so our China's immediate response after the outbreak of the conflict February last year was basically let's have a ceasefire and let's talk. I mean, maybe you should assign blame. We should, but let's have a ceasefire first, because it may make no sense for China to see more bloodshed and killing, whether killing of Russian or Ukrainians, and or risking a wider war in Europe, or even a world war, nuclear war, and because that's a real possibility if you look at how World War I happened in Europe. And so I said this because China has good relation with Russia and Ukraine for decades, and so your immediate response, I always say, if you have two brothers fighting each other, or you're two good neighbors, two good colleagues fighting each other, your immediate response is to ask them to stop and assign blame later. We can talk, but you don't want to give a knife or a pistol to one or the other to stab or shoot each other, because the last thing you want to see among them, right? Even you think maybe some is more wrong than the other. So that's the Chinese stance that being quite consistent since the outbreak. But I think the Western countries, some of them, I think Washington especially, some hawks try to connect, with Ukraine situation with Taiwan, which I think is absurd, because Ukraine is a sovereign nation, independent country. Taiwan is not, is part of China. The U.S. government recognized. I mean, that's our diplomatic documents demonstrate. I mean, all the world, except a few, recognize Taiwan as part of China as a one China policy. So that comparison is totally absurd, I think. And so I don't think it's a valid argument. I think the Chinese would, as the leaders said, I think the people Chinese believe too, we will exercise the utmost patience, we'll make the utmost effort for peaceful reunification. And we want peace, prosperity, economic links. I mean, that's why Taiwan trade the mainland Taiwan trade is enormous. And that's good for everyone. I mean, so don't spoil that. Don't move towards independence. Don't change the status quo. Yeah, just don't do crazy things, okay? I think most of the Taiwan population actually have a consensus. They don't want to pursue independence, and they know that's a dead end, and that means war. But I think, I hope rational people prevail, because often the time the crazy politicians in this world prevail, unfortunately,
Yeah, especially in this part of the world, in the West, where right now, you've been here for many number of years in Europe, and we're watching, Rishi Sunak, of course, the UK exited the European Union officially, but the UK, Britain has been part of Europe for many centuries. But you have Britain right now, really, you have Rishi Sunak in Washington talking about kind of getting on Washington's good side when it comes to China. You also have the EU also taking a much harsher tone toward China, even as it continues to walk this line of, well, we don't want to decouple, we don't want to detach ourselves from China, but we want to de-risk. You had Germany, Annalena Baerbock say that. You've had Joseph Borrell say this. Oh, we need to de-risk because of the coercion that China is engaging in with us. You're here. you work here. I mean, how do you feel about what Europe has been doing around China? It feels like it's been very contradictory, and it is kind of in lockstep with how Europe has treated the Ukraine conflict with Russia, really antagonizing Russia, seemingly on behalf of the United States.
Well, I would say it's fortunate because unfortunate. I mean, because the Europeans right now, I mean, for decades they've been under U.S. Influence. I mean, I would, maybe it's not really exaggerating. I think the outside the U.S. influencing every sphere. I'm a journalist. I mean, even the European media landscape is influenced and actually controlled by investors from the United States. So the rhetoric and not to mention the political in the government, the military, of course, all the U.S. military bases in Germany. So in that sense, NATO is basically controlled by the United States. A lot of European nations are NATO members, so it's not a surprise. I mean, Washington is able to wield this manipulative influence, I would say, over many of the Europeans. But that said, I mean, even you mentioned Sunak, I would say, he actually campaigned during the campaign against Ritz Trust, and he promised to close all the Confucius Institute. But when he took power, he didn't do any of those. And I think that shows Western politicians, some of them just want to talk tough, on China during campaign. They thought it's going to help them score. I mean, unfortunately, they have to make those toxic comments. But when they take office, they just forgot it. They don't want to do that. So that was the dishonesty of politicians. But also at the same time, we actually see the rational politician like French President Emmanuel Macron, who during trip to China in April said Europeans should not be a vassal of the United States when it comes to conflict over Taiwan, because I think it doesn't make sense for Europeans to jump on the, bandwagon of Washington hawks, in this anti-China. China and EU are major trade partner. We have had this win-win cooperation for decades, and we can continue. It just benefits the people on both sides. I mean, it's a great thing. I mean, not to mention all the global challenges we are facing: climate change, pandemic, poverty reduction in poor countries, and all these things. This is far more important than haggling over some differences which actually exist since, say, China's opening up in 1978. We had these differences in political system since 45 years ago. So it's nothing new. Don't make it a fuss just yesterday. It didn't happen yesterday.
Yeah.
So I think we can talk about differences. I think like the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel visited China 12 times, maybe 14, I forgot the exact number. He talked everything about economic cooperation and human rights too. We have different issues. So you can talk about different issues instead of try to name and shame the other, which I don't think is the effective way, especially in East Asia. I mean, there is the East Asia mentality because everybody hyped about East Asia would be the trigger of the Civil War. I mean, look, how East Asia actually solved their differences. ASEAN nation. I mean, even, look at the people hyped about the border dispute of China, India. We don't, despite those occasional clash between our troops, soldiers, none of them carry the gun. They all have this pattern actually only. So you cannot not really kill people. I mean, some people die probably. But, basically you're not going to have a shooting war. So I think that's the wisdom of Asians. Unfortunately, I think Europeans are pushing for this. They rejected this China or Brazil rulers call for ceasefire talks, I think that's the only way, because there is no bad solution in the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, because a lot of Europeans and maybe Americans too, they bet on this so-called Ukraine spring offense, counteroffensive to gain some strength. Then maybe Russia will surrender or be defeated. I think that's naive thinking. Russia is a strong military power, and you're risking a wide war, I mean even nuclear war. And I don't think it's worth the cost of the deaths of more Ukrainian or more Russians. And I think it's inhumane to argue for this fighting to the last Ukrainian. I think if you resort to maybe peace talk, ceasefire, as China and Brazil has called months ago, probably you wouldn't even have this destruction of the dam, on the Danube River, because if we had a ceasefire 2 months ago, 3 months ago, there won't be any more killing. I mean, Then you can talk without the precondition. Everything is on the table, just talk, right? It's better than shooting at each other.
Yeah, well, the United States and the West right now seem incapable of talking. Back in April of 2022, it was the UK, the US, and their allies that nixed the peace deal that Russia and it seemed like Ukraine had agreed to end the hostilities. But I guess to close, Mr. Chen Weihua, people know you. They have a fond view of you on Twitter and social media. There's memes about the victims of Chen Weihua Memorial Foundation. Could you just maybe end with a little bit about yourself and maybe in the context of this changing world? Because you mentioned sort of we've been talking about all these hostilities and conflicts and divisions in Europe, and the US seem to be going in this very counterproductive, almost suicidal direction. But you also have a moment, and you've been growing up in this moment alongside me, and you've been doing work for longer than I have, where the US and Europe are more and more isolated, and China and increasingly Russia are, at least with the global majority, more and more popular in terms of what they offer. So maybe a little bit about yourself to end, and then what you think about this changing world.
Well, I think, China, I always tell people, you mentioned interestingly Twitter, some people introduce me as a sort of fighting some Western politician like hell, I have my critique of China too. I mean, China is not perfect. China is not a paradise, but China is not hell either. So every country, it has a problem, but it has China's achievement, like raising people out of poverty, raising the people's living standards. Like my mother-in-law, I always say, I mean, she is not a party member or whatever, I mean, but she happened to be born in the 1940s generation. She experienced China, through different decades. But life is so much better for her generation now, and she loved the country, supported the government, because you would carry that only the Communist Party member would support. No, she actually supported probably more than, many party members here. But that's just the generation, thing, because her generation experience told her, the country is in the right trajectory, is improving the living standard. Yeah, we are not perfect. We have issues. We have our own complaint. I mean, it's normal for human being. But I think China is building, for example, Belt Road Initiative, infrastructure connectivity, not just in Asia, but Africa, Latin America. I've been to Ethiopia. I mean, the light rail, the railway, because if Ethiopia is a landlocked country, and it depends on the port in Djibouti, the neighboring country. And China built a modern railway linking to Djibouti, because before that was old train railway, and it takes forever. It's from a century ago at least. So I think this is a good thing, because then the Western politician demonize China. debt trap. Why we want a debt trap? If you are a banker, do you want all your borrower not being able to pay back the money? That's stupid, right? And the same argument if you talk to, John Hopkins professor who studied the judge, they disagree. They say, yeah, maybe some country are unfortunate, because of their own management. But China is not seeking any debt trap at all. We just because China is based on its own experience, because why China is able to develop the economy like 10 times in the last 20 years, much faster than most countries, certainly much faster than our, the same state as India and the huge population developing country, because China has this I think a good policy of building infrastructure, roads, highway, the longest high-speed rails and the rest of the world combined, of course. And so that has been a lubricant for economic takeoff growth. That's able, because you have better infrastructure, foreign investment come, people are able to travel between cities, the economy grows much faster. So that China want a developing country to learn and maybe to replicate China's success story, build infrastructure, build roads, then the economy will take off. And we hope the African nations which are struggling for, poverty alleviation, economic growth to, use some of that experience from China. And so we hope we all succeed as a human being, especially the global south you mentioned. So I think that's the rationale of Chinese government, the Belt Road or other, I don't mean everything is perfect. It's not, but if you actually are able to, say, build a better bridge or road, railway in some country better than Chinese done, please show the Chinese. Just don't make nonsense, empty rhetoric, building nothing, just to criticize China, because it's not helpful. Because unless you build a bridge more efficiently, you said more clean environmentally, whatever, and the Chinese, I think, are eager, willing to learn. So just don't make those nasty attack and for nothing. Yeah.
Right. In other words, do better. But Chen Weihua, it was a pleasure to be with you today, to get to spend time with you, meet you out here in Brussels. Thanks to all the viewers here. Appreciate all of you. Holiday continues, but thought it was a nice treat to give viewers your time, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to see you here in Brussels. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone, and until next time.